On a Friday afternoon in March 1971, a man named Kenneth Walsh finished his shift at the Rover plant in Solihull at 4:30, changed out of his overalls in the locker room, went with 7 colleagues to the pub on the corner of the road that every Friday afternoon held the same table for the same 8 men at the same time, drank 2 pints of mild over the course of an hour, and was home by 6:15 in time for his tea. This was not a special occasion. It was Friday. The Friday afternoon pub was as much a part of the working week as Monday morning, as regular and as assumed as the wage packet, and the 8 men who sat at that table had been sitting at it together every Friday since Kenneth had joined the line in 1964. Number 14 on this list was a feature of virtually every large workplace in Britain, France, and Germany from the 1940s through to the 1980s, and has been replaced so completely that most people under 40 do not realize there was ever an alternative. Number 8 was so deeply embedded in the working-class European workplace that its absence from the modern office was not noticed as a loss, but simply accepted as part of what working in the modern economy means, even though what was lost was one of the most significant practical benefits that the working-class employee of the post-war decades possessed. And number 1, the thing at the very top of this list, was not a perk or a benefit or an organized program. It was simply the way that the employment relationship worked between the worker and the employer in the post-war European economy, and its replacement has changed the experience of working life for the majority of European workers in ways that no productivity statistic has ever fully captured. These are 20 things about working life in Europe in the 1960s and 1970s that have completely disappeared, present in the factories and offices and building sites and shops of working-class and lower-middle-class Britain, France, Germany, and the Netherlands from the late 1940s through to the early 1980s. Before we begin, hit that subscribe button, because what Kenneth Walsh's working life contained that the modern working life does not is a question whose answer tells you more about what changed in the European economy over the past 50 years than any economic analysis ever written. Let us count them down. Number 20, the factory canteen and the subsidized works meal. The factory canteen in the large post-war European workplace was not a cafeteria offering individual choice from a commercial menu. It was a subsidized institutional catering operation in which the employer provided a hot meal at a price significantly below the commercial cost, available to every worker at the same time, in the same communal space. A worker at a large British manufacturing plant in the early 1970s could eat a 3-course cooked lunch in the works canteen for between 15 and 25 pence, in a canteen seating 300 or 400 workers simultaneously. The works canteen was the factory's daily social institution, the place where workers from different departments and different grades of the hierarchy were leveled by the shared meal and the shared space. When employers discovered that outsourcing the canteen to a commercial operator reduced their operational costs, and when the individual packed lunch provided an alternative, the subsidized works canteen contracted and eventually closed. Number 19, the clocking-in system and the time card. The mechanical clocking-in system, in which every worker presented a card to the clock machine at the beginning and end of each shift, and the machine stamped the exact time of arrival and departure, was the primary time management tool of the post-war European factory and office from the Edwardian era through to the 1980s. The clocking-in machine stood at the entrance to every factory floor and every large office building, and the specific sound of the card being inserted and the clock's mechanical stamp was the acoustic signal that the working day had officially begun. The worker who was 1 minute late on the clock was docked pay in the specific and undeniable way that the mechanical record permitted. When computerized entry systems and flexible working arrangements replaced the mechanical clock, the specific ritual of the clocking-in moment, the physical act of presenting oneself to the machine as the beginning of the contractual day, disappeared. Number 18, the union shop steward on the factory floor. The union shop steward who represented the workers in a specific section of the factory or office was a worker who had been elected by his immediate colleagues to represent their interests in the daily negotiations with supervision. The shop steward, who challenged the foreman's decision about overtime allocation, who negotiated the tea break arrangement, who represented the worker who had been unfairly treated, was exercising a form of democratic workplace representation that was immediate, personal, and directly connected to the daily experience of the shop floor. When the industrial relations reforms of the 1980s reduced the power of the union structure in most European workplaces, the daily representation of the individual workers' interests in the specific context of their specific workplace became significantly less immediate and less effective. Number 17. The Friday afternoon wage packet, the brown envelope containing the week's net pay in cash, calculated and packed by the wages department for each individual worker and distributed at the end of the working week, was the primary financial event of the working-class European week from the Industrial Revolution through to the direct debit era of the 1980s and 1990s. The wage packet was not merely a financial transaction. It was a physical object that the worker carried home, that was opened at the kitchen table, and whose contents were visible and countable in a way that the bank account credit of the modern payroll system has never been. The specific moment of receiving the wage packet from the wages clerk, counting the notes to confirm the correct amount, and placing the envelope in the inside pocket for the walk home, was a ritual of weekly economic confirmation. Number 16. The Works Social Club and the Workplace Leisure Program. The large employer of the post-war European decades provided not merely employment, but a range of social and leisure facilities for its workforce that reflected the understanding that the worker's life outside the factory was a legitimate concern of the industrial enterprise. The Works Social Club, maintained by a large British or German manufacturer in the early 1970s, might offer subsidized bar facilities, a sports ground, a bowling green, a social program of dances and outings, and a holiday fund to which both employer and employee contributed. The Rover Social Club, the ICI Sports and Social Club, the Volkswagen Betriebssport, and their equivalents across European industry provided a leisure infrastructure for the working class that was separate from the commercial entertainment industry and significantly cheaper because it was subsidized by the employer. When employers decided that social and leisure provision was not a core business function and the facilities were sold or closed, the working-class leisure infrastructure built into the employment relationship was removed and the cost transferred to the individual. Number 15. The apprenticeship as a pathway to skilled work. The formal apprenticeship, in which a school leaver contracted with an employer to serve a fixed term of on-the-job training under the supervision of a qualified craftsman, typically 4 or 5 years, was the primary route into skilled manual and technical employment in Britain, France, and Germany from the medieval guild system through to the 1970s. The apprentice who served his time in the 1960s in a British engineering firm or a French metalworking shop or a German Handwerksbetrieb was acquiring not merely technical skills, but a professional identity, a membership of a specific craft community, and the specific knowledge of a specific trade. First pattern break. Here is where things get interesting, because the practices described so far have been primarily formal institutional features of the post-war European workplace, but the next entries describe the informal culture of the working day, the daily social practices and shared assumptions that made Kenneth Walsh's Friday afternoon pub not an exceptional event, but simply the natural conclusion of the working week, and that have been replaced not by their opposites, but simply by their absence. Number 14. The factory floor and office social culture. The post-war European workplace was a social institution as well as an economic one, and the informal social life of the shop floor and the office, the conversation during work, the shared jokes and shared grievances, the knowledge of each other's families and circumstances that proximity and daily contact produced, was a form of community that the modern open-plan office, the hot desk, the remote working arrangement, and the contract economy have progressively dismantled. A worker who had been on the same line or at the same bank of desks for 10 years knew the people beside him with an intimacy that the modern worker, who may change employer every 2 or 3 years and whose colleagues are distributed across multiple locations, has no opportunity to develop. Number 13. The tea break as a formal workplace institution. The morning and afternoon tea breaks, 15 minutes twice a day in the post-war British workplace and their equivalents in the continental European working day, were institutionalized social occasions in which the workers of a section or a department gathered together away from their work positions in a specific daily suspension of the working routine. The tea trolley that appeared at 10 o'clock and 3 o'clock in the British office was pushed by a tea lady whose knowledge of each worker's preference, 2 sugars for Mr. Harris, no milk for Miss Patel, was a form of personal recognition that the vending machine has never replicated. Number 12. The Long Service Award and the Leaving Presentation. The working-class European worker who had served a single employer for 25 years received a public recognition that was taken seriously as a genuine social honor. The Long Service Award, presented by the works manager in the canteen, the engraved watch, or the carriage clock that represented the employer's acknowledgement of the worker's commitment, was a ceremony of mutual obligation whose sincerity was expressed by the fact that the entire section attended and that the manager presenting the award knew the recipient's name and record. When the average tenure with a single employer contracted from decades to years, the ceremony ended. Number 11. The Workplace Christmas Party. The Christmas party organized by the employer for the entire workforce, held in the works canteen or the social club, was a specific annual event whose character was different in kind from the modern Christmas party at a hired venue. The works Christmas party of the 1960s and 1970s was paid for by the employer, attended by workers from every grade of the hierarchy in the same room, and conducted with a specific license of informality that the normal working year did not permit. The foreman, who was ribbed by the workers who normally followed his instructions, the manager, who danced with the office girls, the cleaner, who sat at the same table as the department head, were all participating in the annual ritual of temporary social leveling that the shared institutional identity of the workplace permitted once per year. Second pattern break. This next one is where the most personal workplace memories lived. Because the practices described so far have been primarily about the collective workplace culture of the post-war European employer. But the next entries describe the specific daily experiences of the individual worker in the post-war European workplace, the physical and sensory conditions of the working day that have changed so completely that the workers who experience them inhabit in their memory a different world from the one their children and grandchildren work in. Number 10. The physical workplace and the specific smell of industry. The working-class European workplace of the 1960s was a physical environment whose specific sensory character, the smell of machine oil and metal in the engineering shop, the smell of wool and dye in the textile mill, the smell of paper and ink in the printing works, was as much a part of the worker's daily experience as the work itself. A man who had worked in the same factory for 20 years carried its specific smell on his clothes and in his memory with a completeness that no description can convey to those who never entered the building, and the closure of the factory did not merely eliminate the employment. It eliminated the entire sensory world in which that employment had been embedded. Number 9. The unofficial perks and the factory gate economy. The informal economy that operated at the margins of the post-war European factory, the practice of taking home small quantities of the employer's materials for personal use that was known by the workers as perks and by the employer as pilferage and was managed by a kind of unspoken negotiated tolerance that fell between the two definitions, was a recognized feature of working-class industrial employment from the Victorian era through to the 1970s. A worker in a food factory who brought home slightly damaged goods destined for disposal, a printer who took home small quantities of paper, was participating in a redistribution of the employer's surplus that the employer tacitly accepted as part of the employment relationship. Number 8. The employer-provided housing and the tied cottage. The tradition of employer-provided housing, in which the large industrial employer, the agricultural estate, the colliery company, or the railway company provided accommodation for its workers as part of the employment package, was a significant feature of working-class European life from the Industrial Revolution through to the 1970s. A coal-face worker in Durham, or a farm laborer in Normandy, or a railway worker in the Ruhr who lived in a house provided by his employer had a housing arrangement that was inseparable from his employment, making his housing secure as long as his employment continued and precarious the moment his employment ended. When the post-war housing program separated the worker's housing from his employment, the company housing was gradually sold off, removing both the benefit and its constraint simultaneously. Number 7. The piece rate and the bonus payment system. The piece rate, in which the worker was paid per unit of production rather than per hour of labor, was the primary compensation model for many categories of manual work in post-war European factories. A worker paid on piece rate in a British clothing factory in the early 1970s had a direct financial incentive to maximize his production, and the specific skill of working the system, knowing how to produce the required volume while conserving effort for the periods when the rate was raised, was a form of practical economic intelligence that the hourly paid worker never needed to develop. Number 6. The works notice board and the internal communication culture. Before email, the works notice board, beside the clocking-in machine, was the primary medium of official communication between the employer and the workforce. The notices pinned to the board by the personnel department, the union, the social club, and the departmental management covered everything from safety announcements to the arrangements for the Christmas party. Reading the notice board was the first social act of the working day for workers who passed it on the way to their stations, and its replacement by the email has changed workplace communication from a shared public medium that everyone accessed at the same physical location to an individual medium accessed privately. Third pattern break. Here is where the story becomes most personal. because the final entries describe not the formal structures or the daily routines of the post-war European workplace, but the specific human qualities of the working relationships that those structures and routines produced. Relationships that the modern economy has replaced with arrangements that are more efficient on some measures and poorer on others. Number 5. The foreman, who knew every worker by name and by capability. The factory foreman of the post-war European workplace was a figure of genuine authority and genuine knowledge who understood the specific capabilities, the specific limitations, and the specific personal circumstances of each of the workers in his section. A foreman who had managed the same 20 workers for 15 years knew which of them could be trusted with the difficult task and which needed to be watched, which was going through a difficult time at home and whose performance would be affected, and which had the ability to progress if given the opportunity. When the downsizing and restructuring of the 1980s and 1990s broke up the long-term work groups, the specific human relationship of the foreman and his team was replaced by the supervisory structures of a more fluid and more mobile labor market. Number 4. The Friday afternoon pub as the week's conclusion. Kenneth Walsh's Friday afternoon pub was not merely a drink, it was the working week's social conclusion, the occasion on which the week's events were reviewed, the grievances were aired, the jokes were made, the news was exchanged, and the transition from the working week to the weekend was conducted in the company of the people who had shared the working week. The pub at the end of the road from the factory was the working class's equivalent of the club dinner or the professional association's annual banquet, the setting in which the shared identity of the work community was celebrated and reinforced in a register of informality that the workplace itself never permitted. When the breathalyzer, the longer commute, and the working hours that extended beyond the traditional Friday afternoon shift ending progressively reduced the after-work pub culture, what was lost was not merely a drinking occasion, it was the social conclusion of the working week. Number 3. The works outing and the employer-organized social calendar. The annual works outing, the day trip to the seaside organized by the employer or the social club for the entire workforce, provided the working-class worker and their family with a collective leisure experience that the individual worker could not have organized for themselves. The coaches that departed from the factory gate at 7 in the morning represented a collective wealth that the individual wage packet could not have achieved, and the day at the seaside that resulted was understood by those who attended it as a direct product of their membership of the working community. Number 2. The physical fitness and occupation-specific health of the manual worker. The working-class manual worker of the post-war European decades maintained a level of physical fitness and a specific set of physically developed capabilities that the sedentary office work of the modern economy has eliminated as a feature of ordinary working life. A factory worker who spent 8 hours per day in physically demanding manual work, who walked to and from work, who dug his allotment at weekends, and who had never been to a gymnasium in his life, was carrying a physical capital that the modern economy, which has transferred the physical demands of work to the machine and the physical demands of leisure to the gym, has separated into components that require separate management in a way that the integrated physical life of the manual worker never did. Number 1. The employment relationship as a long-term mutual commitment. At the very top of this list, above the factory canteen and the Friday afternoon pub and the wage packet and the work social club and all the rest, sits the fundamental character of the employment relationship in the post-war European economy. The expectation, shared by both employer and employee, that the relationship would be long-term, that the employer had obligations to the worker that extended beyond the immediate contractual minimum, and that the worker's investment of their working life in a particular employer's enterprise would be reciprocated with the security, the recognition, and the community that the long-term employment relationship could provide. Kenneth Walsh joined the line at the Rover plant in 1964 and expected, at that moment, to be there until he was 65. The employer expected it too. The social club, the canteen, the long service award, the works outing, the foreman who knew his name, the Friday afternoon pub at the end of the road, all of these were the expressions of the mutual commitment that the long-term employment relationship embodied. When the economic restructuring of the 1980s revealed that this commitment was contingent rather than absolute, and when the labor market reforms of subsequent decades made short-term and temporary employment the norm in many sectors, the entire infrastructure of the post-war employment relationship, the culture and the community and the specific human qualities it contained, was revealed to have been dependent on the long-term commitment that it had expressed. Your parents and grandparents worked in a different kind of employment relationship from the one that exists today. They did not always love it. They did not always appreciate what it was providing, but they knew what it was. They called it their job, and they were right that it was more than that. The knowledge is still here. They knew. Now you know too.